written 6 weeks before he died, an essay entitled The Christic, where he reaffirms his vision. But he asks himself this searching question, whether the wonderful diaphany of the divine at the heart of the universe, which transfigured everything for him, was perhaps no more than a mirage of his own mind. Was this glorious vision of the universal cosmic Christ perhaps an illusion after all? Might Christianity perhaps become extinguished in the world today? After weighing up these large questions, he eventually replied with a definite no, and once again reaffirmed his belief in the overall coherence of the Christian faith and the contagious power of love engendered by this faith. This strength of faith, this Christian fortitude to which Teilhard's life gives eloquent witness, can also be a tremendous source of strength and inspiration for others on the spiritual and mystical quest. Aimed at powerful personal and social transformation, Teilhard de Chardin's mystical vision of the cosmic, human, and divine can nourish and sustain spiritual practice, meditation, and prayer. It also makes a significant contribution to contemporary Christian eco-spirituality, as I've already said. More than anything else, the fire of his words and example can teach us today a spiritual discipline that will ignite a spark, allowing us to live in the divine milieu. The practice of what he calls the divinization of our activities and passivities is a particular way of seeing, reflecting, and responding to life that can transform every experience, whether good or bad, into a significant encounter, one that reveals to us the breath and touch of the Spirit, the ever-loving heart of God. Its potential for transforming ordinary human life into greater growth and wholeness, and into a sense of plenitude, and into an experience of communion is immense. Understood in this way, the heart of Teilhard's spirituality is truly linked to the transfiguration of each life into the ardent adventure of the Spirit. The possibility of a new mysticism provides a powerful focus of attraction. It leads into the world rather than out of it. A mysticism of action closely linked to evolution can inspire the spiritualization of human beings in and through the unification of the world in all areas of becoming. The ascent of humanity is more than an ascent to knowledge. Humankind is called to the height of the Spirit, but nobody can reach this summit on their own in separation from others. The present generation will only follow the call of such an ascent if a dynamic and action-oriented spirituality becomes the true driving force of contemporary society and is nourished by the convergent approaches of science, religion, and mysticism that can ensure a harmonious future for all of life and for humanity on earth. Thank you.
One would think that the young generation of today should have a special interest in Teilhard de Chardin, especially because of the interest in environment, sustainable development, and so on. And yet one feels there is a decline in the younger generation of interest in him and in his writings. To what would you attribute such a decline, if you agree that there is such a decline?
I can't quite I can't hear your question properly. The mic is not working for me sufficiently. It doesn't come across sufficiently strongly. Can you just repeat the last question? Author to study, because also the way his works were published was not in chronological order. So you have to actually work like a detective to see what he wrote in which years, and each of the books carries a selection of essays drawn from the entire span of his life, thematically arranged like Science and Christ or Christianity and Evolution, and they make interesting reading per se, but you really need a really chronological sequence to see how his thought unfolded and what it is centered upon. You see, to really understand what happened to this man, because there is, I have a whole table to show how there is a unity between life and thought. There are the experiences, and then there are the writings, and they're reflected in his very large correspondence by things he's mentioning, and then he writes an essay, and he starts the draft of the essay in his diaries, which are mostly not published, but have remained unpublished. So you have to really do a sort of detective work to get the entire context of his thinking and the way his thought evolved. And most people don't have the time to do this or the means of doing this. And you need, I have a very large library which I've built up over the last 40 years. So, it takes time and it takes effort. But you see, my own initiation, if I may call it this, I owe to a Jesuit who was the professor of dogmatic theology at the Institut Catholique, where I did my degree. And this was very extraordinary. He was Belgian. He was called Paul Henry. He was a world authority on Plotinus. He edited the definite text in Greek on Plotinus' Enneads. And he was absolutely convinced that Teilhard had a great message to give. And he read his essays in manuscript form. And in 1962, when Rome published a monitum saying that Teilhard's ideas should not be taught in any Catholic seminary, he decided to give a public course of lectures in Paris, 6 lectures, and it was a sensation, absolute sensation. The lecture theater was crowded out, and he gave a lecture series on the thought of Teilhard de Chardin. And that was my initiation. And he lent me the manuscript text, the cyclostyle text of The Heart of Matter, from which I have quoted, which is the key text, because it's the text that was written almost last, in 1950, not quite last, but at the end of the life, giving you the clue of how Teilhard's spirituality and mystical vision had developed, in his own words. But that was not published till 1978. It was one of the last things that the French published, you see. And it's very difficult to study under those circumstances. You can almost say Teilhard was a man before his time. He had a vision of coherence and union and of humankind coming together, which blows your mind and was far in advance of what anybody thought at the time, whether Christian or not. He wrote, I'll give you an example, on which I'm just working now, for a conference in China. He wrote in 1927 2 articles on modernization in China and the scientific milieu in China, which he didn't even dare to publish on his own name, which were published anonymously in a New Catholic Weekly, which was published in what was then Calcutta. And we know about this only because he mentions it in one of his letters to one of his correspondents. And I had mentioned this in my first book, and I didn't know whether these papers existed or not, and they have never been published in his writings. And then an Indian Jesuit, a Spanish Jesuit who lives and teaches in India, he went through all these papers from 1927 in India, and he found these articles. And they're absolutely, how should I say, they say things about China which we now can see to be true, but which nobody thought of in 1927. The History Museum in Paris, who was originally giving the grants for doing the expeditions in China, they didn't want him to go over to the natives. He wanted everything that was found in the soil, all the paleontological finds, everything should be sent to the Paris Museum. And Teilhard refused to do this, and he went over to the Chinese and became a member of the Chinese Geological Service. So his grants were cut, full stop, end of story. But he continued with the Chinese for many years. Thank you, sorry. I don't know, that doesn't answer your question, but I'm just trying to explain. I tried to be shorter. Try to shorten.
Yes, I
I don't want to speak against scientists, but there is a certain reductionist view which comes out of scientism. Science, I'm sure, is something very beautiful, but the scientism that comes out and the mentality that it projects in the world, and the manipulation of nature in order to increase power, have more power and money. At the moment, in Malta, there is this debate about IVF, for example, and freezing of embryos. Do you see any connection between what Teilhard de Chardin has to say and his sense of awe towards creation, towards the world, and this other, if you like, way of looking at the world? Does he have something to say? Does he have anything to say to scientists who don't believe in God and who put science as the most important thing, or discovery at whatever cost?
I think he sees more the parallelism and the convergence, not the scientific reductionism. He would never agree with that. He really sees the human responsibility and the ethical positions we have to take. I mean, these new scientific developments, some of which are very harmful, pose enormous ethical problems. So the question of bioethics is today much more urgent than it was during Teilhard's time. So I can't speak on his behalf and say what, one could speculate what attitude he might have taken. I mean, his attitude towards science was generally very positive, and he wasn't sufficiently critical of some of the negative developments, but then at his time, these were much less known than they are today. So this is an immense area of debate and of ethical action that one has to really discuss in great detail. But I would think that his attitude is always related to one of the respect for life, the deep respect for the dignity of life, but also the deep respect of human freedom and the right we have. If that's the right word, it may not be. But we are doing experiments, but we make mistakes. We must also recognize when we make these mistakes and when we are taking the wrong path. So for him, the big moral question is always, which is the right direction to take? And what are the criteria to decide which is the right and the wrong decision? And these are very difficult questions. And I think one cannot answer them easily individually, but we have to really work on this together, to come together what is the best for us as a human group.